Book review time, The House of Morgan. It really kind of follows the American banking system as it exists today from its inception. So JP Morgan Chase, as it is today, really started out as a American lender in London, George Peabody. He eventually brought in Julius Morgan. At the time, America was a debtor country and they had to go borrow money, and London and England were the financial epicenter of the world. As America was building out its railroad lines and growing its cities and building the infrastructure that we have today, we borrowed money from people in London in the form of bonds. Made George Peabody rich, and then eventually Julius Morgan rich. Julius had a son, John Pierpont Morgan was Julius's son. Julius set him up in New York on Wall Street as the American arm of the bank, which eventually became much more powerful than the British arm as the world turned, really. At that time, bankers weren't out there hustling for business. The only way that JP Morgan would take you on is if you were introduced to him by somebody else. And here again, they were really big railroad bonds. He formed US Steel and General Electric. Since it was kind of the birth of the Industrial Revolution going on at the time, so you would have these rate wars, and since Morgan's was lending out to so many people, they would sit on the boards of all these companies. And so instead of having a rate war that bankrupted everybody, they would figure out ways to do either mergers or mitigate rate wars because everybody owed them money. It really was kind of how monopolies were formed, the Morgan's Bank being so involved in the growth of the nation. And that worked really well. And like I said, it was really a gentlemanly banker code. Bankers didn't even go after other people's customers. The only way that you could switch banks is if your current bank gave you a good letter to go to another bank. They were so big, they bailed out New York City in 1907, were funding entire countries, lending to France and Latin American countries, and they was like in the form of bonds. It was really driven by the US government, and it was kind of like, hey, lend these people some money and we'll make sure you get paid. If we have to, we'll send the Marines down. That leads us kind of into eventually what became World War I. And it was interesting because England and France really needed loans by military items, food and everything. So Morgan's was the bank that kind of took on that lead. France and England became greatly indebted to the United States. And then after the war, the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, they all had to pay reparations, but the only way they could do it was getting a loan from Morgan's again and a handful of banker syndicates to rebuild their country. It was like the Morgans were lending money to Germany, who was then paying it reparations to England, and then to France, and then ultimately back to Morgan's. They had super power, which eventually was kind of the catalyst that brought Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler into power, because they were so discontent. These were power countries. They were like, man, we've been relegated to being riddled with all this loans, and it's really put us in a bad financial way. It kind of what paved the way really for World War II. The banks are humming along. It's the 1920s, the roaring 20s, boom, the recession hits. The government start realizing that the banks have been doing, like, I wouldn't call it insider trading, but preferential treatment for bank clients. And they passed the Glass-Steagall Act, which essentially said banks couldn't be involved in both the deposits and lending side and the security side. So at this time, you had Morgan Grenfell in England, and you had JP Morgan in New York. They split that JP Morgan into Morgan Stanley, which handled the securities, JP Morgan, which handled the deposits. And at the time, there was still lots of money in borrowing. In the 20s, but companies were still using banks to raise capital to expand their economic growth. Well, heck, after 1929, people, they weren't trying to expand economic growth. They were just trying to stay in business. Kind of the same thing with the banks. They floundered along until World War II, and they didn't take on near the role in World War II as they had in World War I. And eventually we come out of that, and the banks are reinventing themselves. You're starting to see companies going global. And so it frees up how the banks operate, and they go so out of the lending game a little bit more into mergers and acquisitions, essentially leverage buyouts and hostile takeovers. And so you see Morgan Stanley really take a lead in that. It's interesting at the time because while they were separated, like if you came into Morgan and Company in New York, they'd walk you down to Morgan Stanley if you needed to do securities issues. Hostile takeovers were completely unheard of. Banks never did them. And then you get into the late 1960s, early 1970s, and that's almost all banks are doing are hostile takeovers. And they start going back back into lending to countries, and it gets tight again because that kind of cycle runs through. And then what happens through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the Arab countries really come into their own. They've got all the oil money. Well, guess who's over there again? JP Morgan and Company. There to take all those deposits. They get tons of deposits, which gives them great leverage to lend out again. You kind of see as the world changes, and it always does. That's one thing that really stuck out to me, this book, is that the world and the situations we're in, they're constantly changing. They're constantly areas that are new to us, which are scary, and the bank just changes with it. The one thing I wish, I didn't realize this when I got the book, was it really only goes through 1989. I'd be so curious to see if he wrote something else, an appendix to it that covered 89 to present. JP Morgan Chase is still the world's most powerful bank because they've been able to change with the times. It's one of the things that stuck out to me. If you're interested in the world of banking, it's a funny book. You'll find great stories. You'll find stuff that you just can't believe. Sometimes life is stranger than fiction about how they operated, how some of these deals came together. And you'll really get the understanding of just how the world's changed and how we are to where we are today. Anyways, catch you next week. Angelo DePaola out.